Good morning and good afternoon to everyone, wherever you're located. My name is Eliza Campbell, and as a fellow at the Cyber Program at the Middle East Institute, I'm pleased to welcome you to the third session of our annual conference, which will focus on the role of emerging technologies in the region. The Middle East has grown into a burgeoning center of emerging tech, making major investments in artificial intelligence, defense, and pushing the bounds of space technology and communications. Many nations in the region have recognized the need to diversify their economies in order to achieve 2030 visions and to improve services across the board for their citizens and for their residents. Mass digitization brings abundant benefits for the region, but it also creates risks which require action, regulation, and planning. These are certainly complex and wide-ranging issues, but luckily we have four phenomenal experts to help us think through some of these questions. So without further ado, I'll introduce our excellent panelists. So first we have Dr. Misha Dolar, who's a professor at King's College London in wireless communication, driving cross-disciplinary research and innovation in technology, sciences, and the arts. He's also a fellow at the IEEE, the Royal Academy of Engineering, the Royal Society, the Institution of Engineering and Technology, and a distinguished member of the Harvard Square Leaders of Excellence. Next, we have Danielle Kreis, who's the Senior Director for Global Policy at Palo Alto Networks. As Senior Director, Danielle engages with governments around the world on public policy issues, including on 5G security. She previously was Director for Global Cybersecurity Policy at the Information Technology Industry Council and began her career with 10 years in the US government working on high-tech trade policies and spearheading the government's work on cybersecurity as it intersects with international trade, which should give us some great background for some of these issues that we'll cover. Next, we have William G. Rich, who's the Managing Director for the Middle East and Africa and a Senior Vice President for the Public Sector and Emerging Markets at Karen. William leads operations in the greater Middle East, Africa, and South Asia at Karen, and he also manages the company's relationships with government and regulatory entities, as well as research institutes. William has also worked as a diplomat, as a senior US Treasury official, and as an intelligence officer in the Middle East. And last but by no means least, we have Srini Tumalapenta, who is a distinguished engineer at IBM. CTO for IBM Securities, Srini partners with product vendors, services offering strategy, sales, solution design, and delivery teams to define technical strategy and roadmaps. He takes a keen interest in designing solutions for multi and hybrid cloud security and compliance, while incorporating threat management for comprehensive risk management for enterprise hybrid cloud environments. So I'm really pleased to have you all with us. I think we represent kind of a range of private, public sector interests and across the broad range of emerging tech. And I'm really interested to kind of hear a little bit of a forecast from each of you on sort of where within your respective field of interest and specialization you see kind of the state of the field of emerging tech in the Middle East specifically. So I'm going to go to each of you to offer maybe 4 to 6 minutes of some opening remarks so we can start thinking about how some of these markets will and have uniquely impacted the Middle East region specifically. And what are some trends for our audience to look to the future as we start thinking about where things might head next? So let's, without further ado, go to Misha.
All right. Thank you. Let me start this panel with 3 very specific recommendations. And these are recommendations which I typically give to governments, including the UK government, where I work a lot across policy, education, and of course, technology. Now, my first recommendation, being professor at university, is of course around upskilling. So it doesn't make sense to bring in the most advanced technologies into your country, into your region, if you have nobody who's able to use it, is able to innovate on top of it and utilize it for, financial as well as societal good. So I think it is very important to think from a, university schooling, from a government, but also from a corporate point of view, to make sure that learning paths are implemented which really work along these emerging technologies you're introducing. If you want to introduce IoT, Internet of Things, You need a learning and upskilling path there. If you want to introduce 5G, 6G, cloud technology, you need that there, quantum technology. So therefore, you need to start thinking about this upskilling program, because otherwise you will always be borrowing the skill. So you borrow somebody's skills, contractors come in and they're gonna implement something and then they're gonna leave. And you don't want that. You really want to build a very sustainable ecosystem around these emerging technologies. My second recommendation is around matching supply with demand. So very often from a tech point of view, we are thinking about supply. How do we build the technology? How do we bring in emerging technology? How do we adopt cloud technology in the Middle East, as an example? How do we bring maybe quantum technology in there? Well, that's all good, but if nobody is using that, it's to no avail. So therefore, my recommendation to all governments is for every single dollar, pound, whatever your currency is, you spend on supply, you should spend exactly the same amount on demand. You need essentially start working with the demand side ecosystem very early on, so they are able to absorb these emerging technologies once they become operational and commercially available. And my third recommendation is to make sure you build a trusted environment where parties can work together, which traditionally don't trust very much each other. And we call these sandpit environments. So this could be a barrier busting sandpit environment where you do have large corporates interact with smaller companies, with government departments, as well as with the regulator. And that allows you essentially to start building an ecosystem which trusts each other and builds solutions both from a demand as well as from a supply side point of view in something which is actually operational. More often than not, we find regulation being hit down onto the supply side, which nobody understands why, and it doesn't work, and essentially just, essentially hindering innovation. Therefore, having these barrier busting sandpit environments where these entities can play together and essentially come up with innovative solutions for the future has a much more sustainable roadmap. And therefore, with that, I'm going to finish my 3 recommendations. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Misha. I think there's a lot there, and I'm really looking forward to digging deeper into some of the points that you raised. Next up, let's go to Danielle.
Great, thank you. And yeah, I loved your comments as well. I'm already thinking of how I can kind of match some of what I'm thinking with yours, because those are great points, particularly the upskilling and the trusted environments. We do a lot of that as a company. So I'm going to focus on 2 emerging technologies in particular, 5G and AI, but take them from the cybersecurity perspective. So to me, in a way, that's kind of that matching supply and demand that Misha talks about, because if we're demanding these technologies, and it's very nascent, I think in a lot of the world, 5G rollouts are still being planned, or they're in various states of rollout, and use of AI is the same. But there needs to be the understanding that they can really empower economic growth and innovation, and you need to be demanding security, because if they aren't secure, they really will not be effective. So starting first with 5G, a lot of governments around the world are, again, thinking about 5G or auctioning off spectrum. I think in the Middle East, we're seeing some various phases as well. There's certain sectors in particular, like oil and gas, that strongly leverage industrial control systems, and 5G will enable them to have that connectivity that they need. But with 5G, it's really important that governments promote and industry promote security from the very beginning. 5G is radically different from 3G and 4G. In the earlier iterations of this technology, I think the security expectations were much lower. They were largely used by consumers on their smartphones. If you downloaded malware on your phone, you just brought it into a shop and maybe had it factory reset or replaced. There really wasn't an expectation that the service provider secure that network. And that is completely different with 5G. 5G is going to enable business transformation. It will enable, whole new business models in sectors important in the Middle East, like oil and gas and others. And we need to secure the applications and the services and everything that is being done with those 5G networks, because the repercussions could be lost business and even lost lives in terms of healthcare. So the security's got to be what we call enterprise grade. So zero trust, using automation to secure all layers from all attack vectors, and we can get more into that. And government's role here, I think, is again working with industry to promote a secure 5G build out. and also making sure that regulators are talking with service providers and also with the cybersecurity industry. And companies like ours are helping to upskill, like Misha said, so that we have people who are experts in 5G security. The other point I want to hit on is AI. That's a huge, huge buzzword. A lot of governments around the world are thinking about what that means and thinking, how do they promote it, and also should they be regulating it? Again, I'm going to focus just on it from the cybersecurity perspective. There are many, many uses of AI, but it's become integral now to cybersecurity. So there's always been automation used in cybersecurity. Your basic antivirus software in the beginning was using automation to scan systems and to see if there were viruses trying to come in. That is very simple. We are well beyond that point, and the cybersecurity industry is leveraging machine learning and AI to determine the different attack vectors, the malware, and to use behavioral analytics to stop attacks, including if the malware is already in computer systems, which I think is one way we as a company, for example, used behavioral analytics with SolarWinds, and in our own systems, we were able to stop it before executing in our system. So that is integral to today's cybersecurity. And some recommendations, and I can go into these later, but government should be really looking carefully at AI, and if they are going to regulate, being very strategic about it and realizing that there are some really good uses of AI, like cybersecurity, where you don't want to over-regulate and harm innovation. So I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion later in the panel.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Let's go to Will.
Thanks. Well, I've really appreciated Danielle and Misha's comments so far. I'm going to try to tie a couple of those things together and complement what Danielle said about AI, as well as add a little bit of regional context for viewers who may be familiar with some parts of the Middle East and not others. So I think we hear a lot about AI in this region, particularly in the cybersecurity and defense spaces, but machine learning and AI more broadly is something that the Middle East is really organizing to harness across every major industry. And as we think about economic competitiveness and the Middle East's efforts to shift from an energy to knowledge-based economy or economies, AI is incredibly attractive because it can fill a critical gap among, in particular, the Gulf states, and that is human capital. Being able to increasingly automate functions in supply chain management, healthcare, and transportation, to name a few, using machine learning and other applications of artificial intelligence will be increasingly important to increasing efficiency, lowering costs for government budgets that are already under strain because of the youth demographic bubble, and freeing up the smaller populations to do other important things. And I think one of the first countries to recognize this was the United Arab Emirates, where I live, and they've really made a strategic shift in trying to embrace the applications of AI. And I think understanding that innovation in AI is going to be critical comparative advantage. To Misha's point, they've actually gone so far as to establish an entire university dedicated to it and fostering programs at most of the local universities to train, technically capable workforce and drive tailored applications of existing technologies with an eye towards eventually developing, industry-leading technologies themselves. Easier said than done, of course, but it's interesting to see that the entire country seems to be organizing around this shift. Other Gulf states will certainly follow suit, and in fact, are sort of already doing so in targeted ways. King Fahd University of Petroleum and Minerals in Saudi Arabia, for instance, has established a program in applying AI to chemical engineering, which is essential to shifting the Saudi dominance of the petroleum industry to the higher ends of the supply chain, or of the value chain, rather. The obvious outlier here, which I'm sort of going to leave unaddressed for the moment because it's such a different conversation, is Israel, which has a robust, highly advanced and government-backed research development and application ecosystem. Israel benefits from strong academic and development relationships with both US and Chinese universities and companies. And as kind of an aside, China's advancements in AI are reshaping its relationships across the Middle East as countries attempt to access its technology and know-how which is relatively cheaper and easier to access and with fewer ethical constraints than doing so in the United States. So the Middle East and the Gulf states in particular have jumped from trying to understand the implications of AI to applying it as quickly as possible. And there's certainly risk to that approach, but innovation is not yet originating here. And so the understanding of weaknesses, implicit biases, and implications of the latest applications don't seem to be super well understood. But it's clear that the leadership here has deemed that the risk of rushing to adopt AI is far outweighed by the risk of being left behind. And for me, the biggest limiting factor that I see right now is poor quality data. It's a headline cliche for virtually every cyber-related conference in the Middle East to say that data is the new oil. But just like crude is refined into things that are higher value, industry leaders here are learning that no matter how good the AI technology they buy is, if it's using bad or irrelevant data, it just won't be able to achieve the intended impact. And ironically, the petroleum industry is kind of leading the way in some of the applications, at least here, because of their existing data-driven culture. But the lack of data or poor quality data is really stymieing advancements. And there are a host of interrelated reasons, and I won't get too far into it now. And there are no quick fixes, unfortunately, but modernizing privacy and legal protections around the development of data-driven solutions would be a natural start. Now, I realize I'm going a little bit long, but I did want to touch, as the former Treasury guy on the panel, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about cryptocurrencies, virtual currencies. Consumer demand for virtual currencies and virtual assets broadly has exploded in the Middle East in recent years, but they exist largely outside the financial regulatory frameworks and are being experimented with, but not widely accepted by governments. The exception is Iran, which has embraced virtual currencies at a government level to relieve some of the pressure of US sanctions. Now, the consumer comfort with virtual currencies is not really a surprise when you look at the region's history with currency exchanges, hawaladars, and other more informal value transfer mechanisms, and the need for large remittance corridors with other regions. So Middle East governments have been pretty reticent to officially license and regulate virtual asset service providers, and that stems from both conservative regulators, but also the region's struggles against terrorist financing, sanctions evasion, and money laundering. And the decentralized nature of virtual currencies has the potential to undermine the region's progress in some of those areas. So faced with the inability to access the international financial system, Iran has aggressively entered the virtual currency space and mining. That is the process that generates new currency to such an extent that Iran recently had to ban non-government mining operations for 4 months because of the extreme burden that mining activities were placing on Iran's power grid at a time of rolling blackouts. According to Iran's own statistics, 85% of mining is being done illegally, underpinned by Iran's heavily subsidized energy prices. And the environmental impact of crypto is something being faced by the entire industry, and the Iranian experience really underscores the reality of the energy burden of mining. So with all that, let me leave it there. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm disappointed to hear there aren't any quick fixes, but we'll just deal with it in a long form way instead, I guess. Yeah, with that, let's go to Srini.
Okay. As other team members of the panel mentioned, I have the same messages as well. Where I'll pivot to is cybersecurity is a team sport. We have to be all in together to be able to defend and protect. We are currently in a mode of detect and respond. That's how we do stuff today. We have to move into more of a predict and prevent mode. Okay, how do we get there? The important thing is, I'll pick up from what Misha has mentioned about is the skills. If you don't have the skills globally and regionally as well, it will not be effective. So Misha has mentioned about an approach. What I'll add to that is it's a partnership. Again, it's a team sport. It's about governments, private corporations, leading inventors, institutional agents, all of them combined together, create a curriculum, create a program to educate the regional and educate, they not only become for the pool of resources for the region, but also they could be the pool of resources for the global environment as well, right? We are in a 24/7 operations mode. Doesn't matter where the expert sits. The expert has to be available in a prime shift so they can be effective 24/7, right? So a global skill pool with regional presence is very, very important. So we request the organizations to come forward and put a policy to be able to enable that private-public partnership. Second thing, in terms of all of the panel members touched about AI. What we believe, again, this is in the context of the team sport, it's a trusted AI. How do we enable trusted AI? It's basically based on the information sharing that we can have from one region to another region, one corporation to another corporation, one government to another government. When we have this open standards, open integration that enables the free flow of that information, of indicators of compromise, indicators of behavior, all of those things combined together, we learn from those things. We predict, we present a mechanism to respond, to prevent those attacks. That's how we bring together all of this data, harvest this data. William mentioned about this cliche about data being the new oil, right? If you don't have the right information, all this will become stale. And we learn from the right information. We learn from the trusted information, apply it for the good cause of protecting the world, right? So that's the second part. The third part I would talk about is the key thing is about being prepared. For us to be able to future-proof ourselves, we have to be prepared. We observe a lot of trends in terms of OTs, IoTs, vulnerability management, right? And all of the infrastructure, end-to-end, hybrid or multi-cloud environments or plant sites, all of those things, we got to be prepared. How do we prepare? We got to take a step back and say, is my environment hygiene? We got to start with the basics. Get the hygiene in the environment. Here is a policy that needs to be set up in terms of evaluating the preparedness of the organizations. It's not that we got to patch everything, but what are those specific vulnerabilities that have weaponized exploits in the wild? Take a risk-based approach. Bring the risk-based approach to the top so we are protecting against high-value targets, high-risk environments, and prepare our environments so there will be less and less breaches. Less and less vulnerabilities mean less and less breaches. So that's number one. Number two is about the tabletop exercises, about providing an environment for our teams. We talk about cyber skills, but if the skills are not presented with daily attacks that are happening, the new attacks that could happen, we're not bringing them to the fore. They will only learn from the academics. They will not learn from the real life experiences. So giving them range exercises, these are like the war exercises, prepare them with those exercises, tabletop exercises, create mock exercises, and all those things. So you're preparing them for the real life scenarios. Last but not least, in terms of future proofing think about the quantum. Are you quantum safe? Right? Yes, quantum computing will come into the full commercialization in the near future, but future-proof yourself in terms of thinking about it, talking about quantum safe, crypto, data protection, data discovery, where the data is residing, and have a plan in terms of preparedness. So I would frame in that a team sport in the cybersecurity context, and be open and be prepared.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really like this framing of kind of the team sport of introducing some of these technologies to the region. And kind of in keeping with this, something you all touched on that I think is so central to these questions is the power of human capital and the power of upskilling in the region, especially as some of you noted in a particular region of the world that has an issue with unemployment, with underemployment. So kind of touching on that question, to go to you, Misha, you've coined this term, the Internet of Skills. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about this concept and how some of these questions might kind of be applied to the region as we think about how to equitably and in a secure way kind of introduce some of these technologies to the region and to the economies of the region.
Yeah, that's my baby, the Internet of Skills. I could talk hours about it. I'll make it very short, I promise. Now, before I talk about the Internet of Skills, just zoom back maybe 20, 30 years and imagine somebody told you, in 10, 20 years, we will be able to listen to Spotify on our mobile phones. People have said you're crazy, right? So what we're trying to do here is the new internet I'm pioneering is the ability to execute physical skills through the internet. Okay, I'm touching things and I'm moving things. And, that has been kind of attempted in various forms before, but what we brought in is the standards element. So we are standardizing new codecs of touch and muscle movement, just like MP4, right? So think of MP4 for touch. And also we leverage on this amazing low latency capability of 5G, which you need to transmit action and reaction. And now zoom forward maybe another 5, 10 years and imagine you have an internet which allows you not only to listen to music, watch videos and read your emails, but actually feel through the internet, right? And move objects through the internet. And suddenly you realize that you could execute skills remotely. And that is really where we started reaching out to demand side and asked, for instance, surgeon, what would you do if you had this capability? And we looked at remote surgery. In fact, at King's College, we pioneered this 5G remote surgery concept. What else can you do? Turns out, I could teach people how to play the piano, or somebody can teach me how to paint. So suddenly you're democratizing skills, physical skills, the very same way as the internet has democratized information. And with that, suddenly, I think you can build these kind of skills trade balances more in equilibrium, because there are nations which import a lot of digital skills and export very little. But when it comes to this physical skills capabilities, I think we are rather equal. We are rather equal as nations. And I hope, with that internet of skills up and running, operational, maybe in the year 2025, 2030, we'll be able to give, the Middle East an opportunity to contribute globally to the skills ecosystem.
That's fascinating. No, I think there's so much there and so much to explore. And at the very least, I hope eventually you can maybe use the Internet of Skills to help me upgrade my much degraded piano playing skills. So I'll watch for that. Kind of thinking about this from the more kind of zooming out perspective, how a lot of these questions intersect with governance in the region. I want to go to you, Danielle. So many of the countries in the region and beyond have implemented sort of national frameworks or strategies for cybersecurity. And to this point, there's been some limited cooperation, limited coordination between governments on making sure that outcomes regionally work well for everyone. And sometimes that cooperation really hasn't existed. Can you tell us a little bit more about how strategies in the region seem to be going thus far for the countries that have implemented them or at least released them? And especially what questions this has as we think about kind of equitable and sustainable implementation of some of these technologies, particularly going back to some of those questions about employment, civil infrastructure, things like this.
Sure. I mean, there's so many different types of policies we're talking about, right? I mean, a lot of governments have their basic cybersecurity strategies or a cybersecurity law, or a lot of them in the region, I think, are working on cloud-related laws. And as William mentioned, there's the Minister of AI in the UAE and all the work that they're doing, right? So, I think a lot of these, I think one key thing I want to go back to, and I think we talked about this a bit in the beginning, is it's really important that whatever policy is being developed, that governments be working as closely as they can with the private sector. And I know that depending on the country and the culture, in any part of the world, that's easier said than done or more difficult. But it really is essential because the private sector is innovating in these technologies. They're inventing things like the Internet of Skills. I mean, I've worked in the government myself for 10 years, and we were always fascinated to learn what the tech sector was inventing and what they had coming down in 5 or 10 years, because we are trying to make policy today. But if we don't know what's happening in the future and all the possibilities, but all the challenges, it's really hard to make good policy. I think I also want to highlight, in not any specific countries here, but to the extent possible, it's also important that governments be collaborating and working together. I know that there's various kind of alliances and partnerships in the region, but to harness any of these technologies, the policies have to be globally workable, right? Including things like AI or 5G, and even skills. You can't be having policies that are country specific. And one key policy I want to highlight, I know a few countries in the region are working on their cloud policies or cloud frameworks. That is really important for AI because AI needs the cloud. It needs the massive computing power and bandwidth to hold these data sets and to manipulate these data sets. And so having strong cloud frameworks and policies that enable the growth of the cloud in your country, hopefully cross-border. I know that's not always the first choice, but at least within a country is essential if you're going to be really leveraging AI.
Definitely, kind of going back to that team sport approach. So going to Will, kind of thinking about the emergence of cryptocurrencies in the region. I think about the example of, as a very distant kind of comparison, how radically the idea of single currency in the EU had these implications and these far-reaching kind of questions about governance, about, country-to-country cooperation. And compared to that, how much more the widespread or, not so widespread adoption of cryptocurrencies in the region might have, what implications it might have for how countries relate to each other, how economies are carried out, particularly in informal economies, as you mentioned. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of the security concerns, but also some of the opportunities in the region that are presented by cryptocurrency markets, which are obviously gaining particular attention in the past couple of months, and especially since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Sure, that's a great question. I think as we take a step back and sort of look at decentralized finance, it has the potential to really change the landscape of finance in this region, where most currencies are pegged either to the U.S. dollar or to a basket of currencies dominated by the U.S. dollar. And so I used to like to say that they were importing the best monetary policy in the world. However, with decentralized finance, it creates a situation where a lot of the conservatism and capability they've built in their regulators, both from a banking supervision point of view, from a securities regulator point of view, are kind of completely sidestepped. And so that creates a lot of kind of interesting potential scenarios. Right now, there's probably not potential for a huge shift other than sort of speculative investors. And to a lesser extent, there have been some problems with fraud, cybercrime, terrorist financing, and the like. But relative to cash, relative to other currencies, it's not been too big of a problem. Where it starts to shift is as you get away from sort of first generation cryptocurrencies to things where that are much more sophisticated, smart contracts and other innovations that have come out and are coming out. That's where international regulators really need to collaborate in a way that's probably not going on right now. There are a couple international standards setting bodies, the Wolfsburg Group, the Financial Action Task Force, and others that are sort of doing some thought leadership in this area. But in terms of getting the sort of technical issues around this right, that's where, again, going back to the team sport concept, there really needs to be a lot more kind of public-private engagement between regulators and the people who are innovating in this space, because right now the innovations are just far outpacing any ability to regulate and think about policies surrounding the implications of some of the newer technology, privacy coins and the like. So yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's crucial. And kind of jumping off of that to go to Srini, kind of for our last question, our team captain, I guess, if we're keeping with this team metaphor. So much of this will come down to, as Will noted, kind of effective partnerships, both between private sector actors, but also public-private partnerships, making sure that, regulations around security are implemented across the board and effectively, that there's transparency so that there's security and, equity of use, not only for private companies and their investments and governments that use them, but also for the average user and the most vulnerable and kind of needy users of these technologies in the region. Can you just speak a little bit more to how some of these partnerships we can start thinking about them more effectively? And sort of jumping off your opening remarks, what are some strategies for making sure that this cooperation takes place?
I think the key for the team sport is open integration, right? We have a lot of governments, a lot of private companies, a lot of universities and academia. How do we provide an interchange? How do we create an interchange so the information flow happens through the systems? The information flow happens through the boundaries, right, of this regionalization, and how do we bring that together? So that is one of the most important things that the policy enablers have to look for and help us. We are requesting their help, right? Help us. Now, in terms of what we have been able to do is open source a lot of these utilities. For example, let's take in terms of the trusted AI, right? The trusted AI, it's about a way to bring and audit the machine learning algorithms, models, the data, what the systems are learning from, and make them available for general purpose use. So open source the things that everybody could use. There are also protocols, utilities, libraries that can be open sourced as well. So these are being created at the academia level or at the industry level, but open source it for the general good, right? For the other people to use. So there are things like Sticks, Taxi, and then things like threat hunting language, for example, right? Or the utilities that are used for threat hunting purposes. So as part of this equitable distribution, right? It's don't keep that knowledge just at one place. Use it for the common good, open source it, so everybody could benefit out of those utilities, and then everybody can contribute, enhance those things and contribute to those things. So that'll help us in the long run.
Thank you so much. I think that's a great note to sort of end on, thinking about how to make things more equitable, more open source, more equally distributed, and I hope that's the direction we go. So just kind of finishing up, thank you so much to all of you. We covered a lot of ground today, and there's lots more to cover. I'll look forward to our audience Q&A, which will be live streamed on Wednesday, June 9th. And thank you so much again to our excellent panelists. Let's keep this conversation going. And thank you again.